On a freezing April morning in 1917, tens of thousands of Canadian troops raced from their trenches and secretly dug tunnels to emerge into the Western Front's infamous no man's land. Their objective? Vital high ground, which had for years withstood Allied assaults. Over the next 3 days, in a remarkable display of courage under fire, they would advance through the German lines and into the history books. In this video, with the help of the latest technology and rare original film from that fight, we'll explore the iconic battle which forged a nation, Vimy Ridge. Vimy itself was never going to be, nor was it meant to be, a war-winning assault. Instead, it was a small part of a much larger plan. By spring of 1917, stalemate had reigned across the Western Front for years, though many attempts had been made to break the deadlock. That April was no different. This time it will be the mighty French army that would lead the way. Under General Robert Nivelle, they'd come up with a plan to smash through the German lines along the Chemin des Dames. Once broken, they would push through the 30-kilometre gap to collapse the German army on the Western Front. But in order to make that initial breakthrough possible, Britain and her then empire were called to assist. By launching their own attack a week before the main French thrust, they were to weaken the enemy line and stretch their sparse reserves ever more thinly. That attack, on a 20-kilometre front known today as the Battle of Arras, would in effect be a diversion. But in order to make the Arras offensive successful, a key piece of high ground on the British northern flank needed to be secured: Vimy Ridge. So in effect, the assault on Vimy, with limited objectives, was a diversion of a diversion. But that certainly didn't mean that taking it would be easy. Let's understand why. By adding on a modern map to the satellite view, we can see here that Vimy Ridge, an approximately 8-kilometre long high point running north-south, was a key German defensive position. By controlling the high ground here, they could observe enemy movements, control the area with artillery, and have all the advantages that come with holding an elevated position. Turning back to the satellite and now overlaying this remarkable trench map, detailing every single trench in the sector, accurate to within a few meters, with Allied lines in blue, German in red, and the circles representing mine craters, we can understand its importance a little better. In short, the Germans had turned this position into a fortress. Long gone were the days of single trench lines. Now the entire area was a veritable web of interconnected multi-line defences, sited to support each other, make the most of the terrain, and make it almost impossible for any attacker to achieve any substantial breakthrough. The key locations on the ridge itself were to be found here, the high point of Hill 145, on which today stands the iconic Vimy Ridge Memorial, and this location to its north, another high point named the Pimple. Both were heavily defended, as were the fortified villages of Télus, Vimy and Fabu. When we add in machine gun positions, defensive mine craters and hundreds of miles of barbed wire all placed to canalise attacking forces and 40,000 determined German defenders, attacking Vimy Ridge was, in short, a nightmare. There's another thing to add in here. No man's land along this part of the Western Front was very small. By zooming into this area from a German perspective and switching to the drone, we can see the preserved trench lines in modern Vimy Memorial Park. Believe it or not, these lines here are the German forward positions, saps and listening galleries, and just here are the Canadian ones, which in this part of the front were incredibly just 40 metres apart. With huge defensive mine craters blown between them by the British the previous year, they had formed these narrow ridges, along which any attacker must travel in order to cross the ground, usually with several machine guns pointed directly along them. A grim prospect. But taken it had to be, which involved capturing multiple individual trench lines across this entire area. The actual Canadian objectives were marked at the time by designated coloured lines, with the first, the black line, running here, due to be captured early on the opening day. Beyond that, here, including the heights of Hill 145, was the red line, and beyond that, but limited largely to the broader southern part of the battlefield, were the blue and then the brown objective lines. Our focus though will lie in this northern corridor, with the 1 kilometre assault towards Hill 145. And that job predominantly fell to these men, soldiers of the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force. All told, 4 Canadian divisions, fighting together for the very first time, a total of around 120,000 men would be involved in the attack, with, conveniently for us, the 4th, 3rd, 2nd and 1st Divisions advancing line abreast, with the task of taking Hill 145 lying within the 4th Div sector. What about those men doing the fighting? Let's meet a few. Private Alec James Ambler. Born in England but emigrating to Saskatchewan in 1905, aged 21, he was a gifted stonemason by profession, but like so many of his friends, volunteered to serve, joining the Highlanders of Canada before arriving in the Vimy area in early 1917. And Private John Patterson. Born in London in 1875, he was 42 years of age, older than the vast majority of soldiers in the CEF. Having emigrated to Canada before the war, he had very likely enlisted in 1916 in order to serve alongside his son. By 1917, he found himself in the 50th Calgary Battalion, CEF. Let's make a quick point here. Whilst Vimy is today rightly remembered as a defining moment in Canadian history, it's not an exclusively Canadian one. In fact, not only was an entire British division involved in the assault, but like Ambler and Patterson, somewhere in the region of 40% of Canadian soldiers at the time were British born, and most of the artillery involved was British, making it a truly allied affair. So what was the prize? Well, really it lay beyond the ridge in this area, the Douai Plain. A historical coal mining region, it was pan flat apart from these enormous pyramid-like slag heaps, meaning that the occupier of Vimy Ridge and Hill 145 could look down onto the plain. If the Canadians could capture it, not only could they secure the northern flank of the Arras attack, but they could also serve to observe the enemy for tens of miles around. But how to do it? Vimy had been attacked multiple times before, but those attacks had been by the French. The closest anyone had come to gaining the heights were French North African troops in 1915, who in a bloody frontal assault with limited artillery support had almost reached the crest before being forced back again. The Canadians, though, would do things differently. Canadian Corps Commander Sir Julian Byng, well aware of the old problems in First World War battles, would introduce some key changes for the attack at Vimy. In brief, he would train all troops behind the lines on scale models of the battlefield before the attack, with this wartime footage actually showing that very moment. The result being that all troops knew exactly what the battlefield would look like and where their objectives lay. He would have tens of thousands of maps printed and issued to troops to help reduce confusion in the quagmire of no man's land. He would also institute the most comprehensive rolling artillery barrage of the entire war to date to protect troops when going over the top. Let's explore this idea a little more. By adding in the actual barrage map over the ground to be attacked, we see that the artillery, firing from behind the Allied front lines, would lay down a rolling screen of artillery fire over the enemy-held area at a precise speed, with each line here showing the location and how many minutes after 0 hour at which the guns would fire. The idea being to force the Germans into cover, with the Canadians advancing as close as possible to the barrage before charging enemy trenches at short range before they had a chance to recover. Finally, he had one more trick up his sleeve. As used in the main British attack at Arras, the Canadians would use underground tunnels to great effect. By digging subways, like this preserved one at Vimy Ridge, which opened in the Allied front lines or even sometimes into no man's land, secrecy could be maintained. Overflying German aircraft wouldn't see the telltale signs of attack, thousands of men lining the trenches, because most Canadian forces were safely underground, waiting for the word of advance. In fact, for weeks before the attack, this had been going on, with men occupying souterrain behind the lines to stay out of reach of gunfire and out of sight. One such man was Alec Ambler, the stonemason, who put his remarkable skills to full use with these carvings recently discovered in a souterrain named Maison Blanche, not far from Vimy. That's not to say the battlefield above ground was quiet in the days before the attack. There had already been large-scale artillery duels with gunners on both sides engaging in counter-battery fire to knock out enemy guns before the attack. Finally, with all plans in place and men ready for the off on a freezing Easter Monday in 1917, 850 guns once again roared to life at 5:30 a.m. along the entire 8-kilometre front, slamming shells into the German lines in a methodical and relentless wall of fire, with that actual moment caught on film in these rare scenes. Moments later, and caught in this grainy film, the 1st Canadian troops left their trenches and emerged from hidden subways to follow hot on the heels of the barrage as it progressed across no man's land at a rate of 100 yards every 3 minutes, devastating the ground as it did so. And at first, it was a huge success. Despite an uncomfortable snowstorm blowing straight into the attackers' faces, in the south the infantry were able to advance close behind the barrage and into the German first and even second lines, encountering only light resistance as many defenders were simply too stunned to fight back. In the centre too, the progress was good, and by 6:25 the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Divisions had captured the Black and parts of the Red lines. Only here in the north were things not going so well. Part of the problem here was that the ridge, at only 1 kilometre deep, was under far heavier shell fire than other areas, meaning that 1. The ground was torn up and much harder to cross. 2. Large numbers of troops packed into a small area caused lots of confusion. And 3. Despite the shell fire, a number of determined German machine gunners retained their guns and positions and opened a relentless fire on the advancing Canadians. The net effect of these problems was a big one. That rolling barrage, advancing at 100 yards every 3 minutes, was soon lost in the distance, and the protection it had offered so effectively further to the south was now not available for the men of the 4th Division, who came under increasingly heavy enemy fire. Within minutes, the 2 leading Canadian battalions in this sector had suffered massive casualties from both front and flank, as this position at the Pimple, which too remained untaken, poured a lethal enfilade fire into the flank of the advancing troops, with a single bullet often hitting multiple men. Despite the carnage, the Canadians pushed on, though again machine guns that had survived the bombardment continually took their toll. In fact, it's likely that just 2 German machine guns in the wilderness of shell holes were able to hold up the entire leading battalion of 700 or so men who advanced towards Hill 145. And whilst the Black Line was eventually reached in this sector, the attack stalled short of the Red Line and the crest of the ridge, now only 200 metres away. But in the conditions of the day, 200 metres was far from easy. By overlaying this aerial image of the time onto the exact location where it was taken, just north of Hill 145, we can get some idea of that hellish landscape. Those shell holes, filled with freezing water and mud ankle deep, made every movement painfully slow. Amongst them, often unseen, lone riflemen or the far deadlier machine guns would burst to life at almost point-blank range, inevitably hitting the attackers hard. By taking a short drone flight over that very same ground today, we can even see a century on how badly that ground was destroyed. It was across this very area that on the evening of the 9th of April, one more attack was made by the 85th Battalion, Nova Scotia Highlanders, who with incredible determination pushed on, clearing trench traverses one at a time in a ferocious hand-to-hand fight. Advancing from shell hole to shell hole under withering fire, they eventually reached Hill 145 and began a brutal fight for the summit. But exhausted, with 58 men killed and over 300 wounded, and with night now descending, the Highlanders simply didn't have the energy or men to complete the task, and 9th of April ended with both Germans and Canadians holding shattered trenches just yards apart on Hill 145. The opening day had been utterly horrific for everyone involved. Thousands of men from both sides lay dead or dying across the battlefield, with many of the living soaked from waterlogged shell holes and perspiration, now forced to pass a sub-zero night in a living nightmare. To make matters worse for the Canadians, the Pimple had still not been taken and more casualties were sustained throughout the night. In fact, the Pimple was the real danger point, and it was from here at about midnight that a German counterattack was launched in an attempt to wrestle back the slopes of Hill 145. But like the Canadians before, the ground was their undoing. Advancing in darkness through an obliterated landscape, many lost their way, stumbled into a lone Canadian machine gun post, or simply had the boots sucked from their feet in the mud and had to make an ignominious barefoot return to their trenches without seriously challenging Canadian resolve. The final scenes in that brutal play came to pass the following day on 10th of April, when Canadians once again launched an attack to clear the remainder of the ridge and the lower slopes of Hill 145. Amongst the attackers was Private John Patterson, whose bravery was so crucial in the advance. Extract from the London Gazette. For most conspicuous bravery in attack, when the advance of our troops was held up by an enemy machine gun which was inflicting severe casualties, Private Patterson, with utter disregard of his own safety, sprang forward and, jumping from shell hole to shell hole, reached cover within 30 yards of the enemy gun. From this point, in the face of heavy fire, he hurled bombs, killing and wounding some of the crew, then rushed forward, overcoming and bayoneting the surviving 5 gunners. His valour and initiative undoubtedly saved the situation and made possible the further advance to the objective. Thanks to the courage of Patterson, who would lose his life just 2 months later and never learn of his award of the Victoria Cross, and men like Alec Ambler, who would fall wounded but live, the lower slopes were cleared, and by the afternoon, the 10th of April 1917, Hill 145 was secured, and Allied troops could for the first time, as we see in this remarkable film of the time, look down off Vimy Ridge to the open plains below. In the coming hours and days, the remainder of the ridge would be secured in a brutal close-quarters fight, including the Pimple, in what ultimately became, for the Western Front at least, a rare, clear and definable success. But one that came at a heavy cost to both sides. All told, Canadian and British casualties at Vimy Ridge were almost 3,600 killed and a further 7,000 wounded, whereas losses to the German army remain uncertain, though at least 7,000 men were killed and wounded, with a further 4,000 taken prisoner. Today, Vimy Ridge holds a key place in Canadian collective memory. It's the site where so many of her sons made the ultimate sacrifice in the Great War, and it's an extremely powerful place to visit. Perhaps most spectacular is this, the Canadian National Vimy Memorial. Standing directly on top of Hill 145 and surrounded by the remains of trenches and shell holes that once dotted the land as far as the eye could see, it's also inscribed with the names of 11,285 Canadian sons who lost their life in France during the First World War and who today have no known grave. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to know more about the battle for Vimy Ridge, be sure to check out Not So Quiet on the Western Front, our dedicated First World War podcast, where recently myself and my co-host, Dr. Spencer Jones, took a deep dive into the subject alongside guest historian Jesse Alexander. Catch it right here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.